Okay, in the interest of time, I'd like us to get started today. So I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone who's tuning in live, but also to welcome those who might watch the recording at a later date. And so we will share this recording with all attendees and people who are registered, but also on our website. We'd also like to thank Alumni Affairs and Development for help in partnering to host this webinar. As you can see by the number of attendees, it's been quite popular. So we're really excited to move forward today. So, just to introduce myself, my name is Philip Miller, and I'm a professor in the Department of Human Health Sciences here at the University of Guelph. And I'm the first inaugural director of the new Institute for Lifestyle Integration of Food and Exercise, otherwise known as the Institute for Life. And so we are only about a year old, and we will talk about some of the goals and vision of our new research institute. But I'd like to just set the stage a little bit why we created this initiative. So many of us are aware that chronic diseases have a large impact in the Canadian population. Approximately 44% of Canadian adults report having at least one common chronic condition. So you can think of ones like hypertension, osteoarthritis, mood disorders, diabetes, all as being individual chronic conditions that require management over a really long span of your life and that can have very significant impacts on individuals' quality of life. What our approach is really going back to targeting some of the known causes and contributing factors. And I really like this quote that acknowledges while we have important determinants of health related to our genetics, our environment, our social and medical care availabilities, we really know that some of the most important factors contributing to health outcomes are our individual lifestyle and behavior choices. And so the figure that I'm showing you at the bottom here comes from the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, which have really identified six key lifestyle behaviors which can positively impact health outcomes. And that is substance use and alcohol use, diet, physical activity, sleep, social connection, and stress management. And that by thinking about these as really a medicine approach rather than just a lifestyle behavior, that we are able to have positively impact some of these chronic health conditions. And just to kind of highlight with some of the statistics to try to convince you of my point, physical activity is 1.5 times more effective at reducing mild and moderate depression symptoms, stress, and anxiety than medication. Exercise training in people with stable coronary artery disease results in greater event-free survival. So less risk of having a cardiovascular event in the future and actually has a lower cost for administration than getting an implanted stent. Exercise can reduce the risk of falls by up to 36%. And finally, regular exercise reduces the risk of dementia by 28% and Alzheimer's disease by 45%. And so I've highlighted some related to exercise, but we're going to also talk about some related to diet today. So the Institute for Life, which was, as I said, recently founded, is located within the Department of Human Health Sciences, within the College of Biological Sciences. And we are a collective of over 25 faculty and over 100 graduate students, really focused on studying the applied and mechanistic questions related to exercise, diet, and lifestyle factors. Our mission is to advance human health by pioneering research at the intersection of food and exercise. So we're really dedicated to both developing and promoting lifestyle solutions that enhance well-being, prevent disease, and empower individuals to lead healthier lives. And really, in this day and age, keyly through evidence-based practices and innovative approaches. Our vision is really to help create a world where personalized, holistic approaches to food and exercise are seamlessly integrated into our everyday life. And we aspire to be really a leading authority in transforming health outcomes globally by bridging scientific research with really practical, sustainable lifestyle changes. Something that we can provide to the public so that we can help to improve overall health. Within our institute, we are dedicated to five strategic pillars. These focus on healthy aging, cardiovascular disease, obesity and diabetes, balance and mobility, and brain health. And you can think about our presentation today, in which we're going to hear about protein intake and its relationship to muscle mass being important for both healthy aging. It touches on obesity, but it's going to have impacts on balance and mobility as well. And so many of our researchers are having themes or projects that cross-cut across many of these strategic pillars. Why us? So we think that we bring a very unique breadth of expertise. So our department has historical strengths in both the exercise and the nutrition spheres, and that we think this provides us really unique opportunities to develop innovative collaborations to address really these major societal challenges that we're facing today. We have existing departmental strengths in terms of a dedicated human nutraceutical research unit that allows for collaborations with industry and commercial companies. We have an ongoing Guelph family health study that looks at healthy eating behaviors in families with young children and follows them over time. And then we're involved in the Smart Healthy Cities training platform. So, how do we design cities so that we can best encourage both healthy eating, daily physical activity to move forward? To address these, we really have a three-pronged approach. We're trying to address three issues. We want to be at the forefront of cutting-edge research, supporting both exercise and nutrition science. We want to be involved in community education and outreach. So events like today, where we can provide knowledge translation about some of the information that we've gained from our research. And then we want to continue to think about graduate student education. So we always need to equip that next generation of leaders with both the hands-on training and mentorship so that they can really strive to help create and continue the momentum of discovery and discovering solutions. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today. So, our speaker is Dr. Everson Nunes. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Human Health Sciences at the University of Guelph, and he specializes in human metabolism, metabolic health, and protein nutrition. His research focuses on how aging alters protein requirements and how targeted dietary strategies can support muscle health and functional resilience. I think we all can take notes. I know I'm going to be taking some notes during this presentation as well. So I am very excited to hear Dr. Nunes's talk, Eating for Resilience, Why Protein Matters More as We Get Older.
Thank you, Phil. Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here talking about protein today. I talk a lot about protein, muscle, aging. I hope everybody enjoys the topic. It's a trend topic. If you go online, you see a lot of posts on social media about it, a lot of videos about it. So it's a very exciting topic to discuss. Uh, if you want to connect, you can scan my QR code here on the screen. I'm going to put it on the last slide as well, so you can get access to my email, my LinkedIn page, and if you want to just exchange some messages, ask questions in the future, just feel free to do that, okay? Uh, Okay, so just I want to say thank you to the Life Institute to invite me to be here today. I'm a new faculty in the department. I'm very excited to be part of the department and to work with all these great people that have been doing a great job in just putting the institute together and working on all these research lines, which are very important for our quality of life and health in general. Okay, so before we start, let's go over some important things. I have some disclosures. So I did have funding from some associations related to protein, some companies related to protein supplements, protein nutrition, but all the ideas I'm going to share here today, they come from my experience, my research, from the several years I've been working with those topics. Another disclosure that I want to make is that I am omnivorous, so I do eat plant-based and animal-based proteins. So that is important. So everybody knows that some of the examples I'm going to use here, they might be biased because of my way of eating as well. Okay. First, let's start with our land acknowledgement. So our campus here at Guelph, it's on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples under the Dish with One Spoon Wapum agreement. As a newcomer to these lands, I'm grateful to learn and work here. Let's talk protein then. So let's do something as an exercise, something that a lot of people do. People go online these days and they try to search for information about everything, right? So that's what I did here. So I went online and I was curious about what kind of questions people ask about protein. And I've been doing that for many years. I've been working and teaching about protein for the last 25 years. So I've done that several times using different tools. So now we are in that AI era, right? So everybody's crazy about AI. So I was just curious about what AI can tell me about and the curiosity of people in the protein nutrition field. So the question was, what are the most frequent questions in the protein nutrition field? That was my prompt there. And this is what I got. If you go and do the same, you might get something similar. You get a different order of priorities and the questions people make, because that usually depends on what's trending online, right? So I did that last week, so that's what I got. So the first topic there was protein requirements. What is protein requirement? Protein requirement is how much protein you should eat per day. So I can see here, based on the response, that a lot of people are asking about how much protein they should eat per day. So we're going to go over that during the talk. So we're going to talk about requirements for humans in general, but we're going to emphasize the requirements during aging because that's the priority here for this talk. Okay. Uh, and another topic that people talk about, besides how much protein we need per day, is what kind of protein. And what kind of protein relies on the topic protein quality. And that question comes because not every protein is the same. So depending on where you get your protein from, you get different kinds of protein. Because if you eat beans, if you eat chicken, if you eat fish, you have different proteins in those food sources, right? So in that topic, where the protein comes from is what protein quality means. So we're going to explore several things about protein quality because some of those things are also important during aging. Okay. So if you go and dig in the answer that I got from my AI helper here, you see that under protein requirements, older adults is something that's there. So we're going to talk about this today. So requirements for older people. And there's something here, there's a number here. So this number is a recommendation for protein ingestion. So a very popular recommendation in several countries around the world is that we should eat 0.8 grams per kilo per day of protein. So we're going to talk about if this is sufficient, if there's another number that will be better for the aging journey that we are going through. And we're also going to discuss something about protein quality, and protein quality kind of gets into the topic of comparing proteins. And a very popular topic in comparing proteins is what you can see here is the discussion about plant-based proteins and animal-based proteins. So we're going to go over that as well during our talk. Okay. But before we start, we have a question for you. So because we're talking about protein requirements, I want to know if you have an idea of how much protein you think you should eat per day. Okay, so we have a pool. So go over your screen and answer for us that what you think. So do you think you need like less than 60 grams per day? Do you think you need something around 60 or 80 grams per day? Or is something around 80 or 100 grams per day? Or is more than 100 grams per day? So please answer. And then we're going to go over the responses of everyone, and we're going to have to try the correct answer according to the scientific evidence we have in that field. Let's give it about 30 seconds. Okay. I think we have had enough time. So let's see what we got. Okay, a lot of people replying here. So we have 10% saying less than 60, 40%, 44% around 60 and 80, 33% around 80 and 100, and 13% around 100. Okay, so we're gonna go over the correct answer, and but I want to say that the correct answer depends. So it depends, is very personalized. So this answer depends on a lot of aspects around your life, and that so it's different for everybody. So when we go over recommendations, you're going to see that we're going to say numbers, and we might have a range of numbers, but that range doesn't mean that it works for you. It might not work for you if I go over your diet, how you eat, where you get your food from, what you do during your daily as your daily tasks, if you do exercise or not, and how old you are as well. So all those aspects have to be taken in consideration when you're talking about how much protein we need. Okay, it looks like an easy question, but the answer is not that easy, and that's why it's a question that's so popular. It generates so much debate because the answer is not easy. It's not simple. It is a complex answer to get. Okay. Okay, so thank you everybody for answering that question. And let's go over now. Let's try to find the answer. So one important thing. So when we talk about protein, you can also see that protein always come as a response very close to the word muscle. So it's very, very easy to find the topic protein related to muscle. And why is that? Why do we talk about muscle when we're searching stuff about protein? So one important thing that everybody needs to know is that our muscles are made mainly of protein. Of course, our body, the main thing that it is in our body is water. But when we talk about muscle, besides the water, if you take the water out, muscle is mainly made of protein. And those proteins have different functions. In the muscle tissue, of course, you have the proteins that are related to contraction. So they are related to the things we do over the day. So when you move, when you perform exercise, when you perform your small tasks at home, like washing the dishes, climbing stairs, everything is related to the contractile function of the muscle. Okay, just some numbers here so everybody has an idea. So if you get a human male, you have around 40 to 50% of muscle in their body. Most of our muscle mass is in the lower limbs. That is the same for men and women. And for females, we have around 30 to 40% of muscle in their bodies. When you look into that tissue, we're going to see that water is the main part of that tissue. But if you get rid of the water, protein becomes one of the main constituents of that tissue. So protein is an important part of the muscle. And that's the reason why when people talking about protein, they usually talk about muscle as well. And you're going to see why protein is so important for our muscles over the talk today as well. Okay. So just to remember that muscle is not only important for movement, muscle is also an organ important for metabolism control. So it's good for regulating blood sugar. It participates in the regulation of your immune function as well. So it's part of the defense system. It's also involved in bone health. So there's a lot of things that the muscle does that are involved in the regulation of a lot of other processes that we usually don't think about it. So it's also related to brain health, is also related to decreasing the risk of several diseases. So when you talk about muscle, you have to think about all those aspects that the muscle can be related to as well. Okay. So let's go and try to find the answer to the question we sent you. So we were asking how much protein do one of the most frequent numbers you're going to find to answer that question is 0.8 grams of protein per kilo per day. So that is the amount of protein that a lot of countries recommend to for people to eat per day. So they maintain health. So that number is the number that's recommended to maintain health. That number has been around for decades so far. And of course, where you're getting your protein from, you're getting the protein from the food you eat. Basically, all the food we eat have a little bit of protein, but the amount of protein that you're going to find in specific types of food might change. So you might have a broccoli, for example, that has protein, but if you compare the broccoli to a piece of beef, then the piece of beef might have a little bit more protein. And that goes on. So the list goes on. So you can do a lot of comparisons. And the thing that's going to change is that the amount of protein you're going to find in the foods we eat is going to be different, but also the type of protein you're going to find in those food sources we eat might be different as well. And we're going to discuss a little bit about that. So let's go back to the number. So this number is called the RDA for protein, is the recommended dietary allowance for protein. That number is around for decades, like I said, and in US, this number went up early this year, but a lot of different countries still use this number as the minimum amount of protein you should eat per day. So we need to know that this number was calculated several decades ago, and is the minimum for survival. So to keep your body working, that doesn't mean this number is the optimal number when you're talking about other aspects of your life. So it's the minimum number for survival. And doing a quick math, let's say I'm going to calculate how much protein per day I should eat. So my weight is 80 kilos. If you go down here, I have the math here for you. So if I follow this number, that means I should eat at least 64 grams per day of protein. Of course, I'm not going to eat that in only one meal. I'm going to split that in a couple of meals per day, depending on the way I eat. So it's easier to ingest, but I need to know that's the minimum for survival. So my body can live with that, but that doesn't mean is the optimal amount I should eat per day. So that number has been tested several times in a lot of studies. And in the last 20 years, it became clear that for optimal muscle health, we need to invest in a higher number. And the number we have so far that has been showing good results in terms of muscle health, especially in the aging population, is around 1.2 and 1.6 grams per kilo per day. Please take a look here and see that is not a fixed number. It's not one number, it's a range. That's because this number can change for each one of us. And even for you, this number might change on a daily basis as well, depending on what you do, what you eat, your food choices. So that number is not a static number. Of course, if you go to a dietitian, for example, that professional might work with one number because it's easier to plan a diet with one number. But in real life, we need to know that every day our requirement might change a little bit. So it can be a little bit more one day, a little bit less another day. But the average is actually what matters. So the average in a week, the average in a month, that's what really matters, right? And so we have a lot of studies so far showing that this range is the optimal range for muscle health, especially in the older population. Okay. So if I do a quick math here using my body weight, that means I don't need only 64 grams per day. I need a little bit more. So I need something around 96 to 128 grams per day of protein. And of course, I can work with my dietitian to find what is the perfect spot to maintain my muscle health and also to maybe improve my muscle mass if that's something that I want to do, or maybe improve my muscle function if that's something I want to do as well. Okay, very important. We talk a lot about protein and protein requirements, but our body doesn't actually need protein. What our body needs are something called essential amino acids. Just to remember, amino acids, they are the small blocks that make proteins. So all proteins are made of amino acids. And we have in our body the requirement for 9 amino acids that we call essential amino acids. Those 9 essential amino acids are amino acids that our body can't produce in a certain amount that covers our demand for those amino acids. So some of them we can't produce at all, and some of them we might have the capacity to produce, but we produce in a very, very low amount. So it's not enough. We need to eat them. So those essential amino acids we have to obtain from our diet. So when we are eating protein, actually what our body is looking for are those essential amino acids, and I have all of them listed here down for you. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of them, and we're going to talk a lot about leucine today. So leucine is a special amino acid for muscle. All of them are important, but leucine has a special role, and we're going to go over that role as well. Okay. Uh, so we need essential amino acids, and we find those essential amino acids in all foods we eat. Some foods might have a little bit more of them, some foods might have a little bit less. And depending on the food source, we might be missing one or another. And we're going to discuss a little some things about that as well. Okay. So let's go back to the numbers. So there's a lot of evidence showing that if adults eat less than 0.8 grams per kilo per day, they are at high risk of losing muscle mass, losing muscle function, and over months or years eating that kind of diet, you can have a high risk of frailty, disability, and also losing your independence, so relying on other people to take care of you. Just because moving becomes harder and doing the things that you do every day become harder as well. And that's all related to muscle mass and muscle function. So eating less than 0.8 grams per kilo per day of protein puts you in a high risk of disability. When you go to the 0.8 right on, so we know now that this number is not sufficient for muscle health, especially for the aging population. So if you are in this range, close to this number, think about and maybe reflect of going a little bit further and try to reach the range of 1.2 and 1.6. We have a lot of studies so far showing that this is the optimal range for muscle mass and muscle function, especially for the aging population. Okay. This is a study that I ran a couple years ago. And here, what we did was to test different diets. So low protein, 0.8 grams per kilo per day, and high protein, 1.2 grams per kilo per day. What you have here in this graph is whole body protein balance. So it's the protein that the body of the people involved in the study was synthesizing and breaking down during the day. I want you guys to take a look to this part of the graph here. So those two bars that you see under the arrow here, they show how the protein balance was in the group eating more protein, 1.2 grams per kilo per day. So when compared to the lower protein group, we can see that those people had a higher protein balance. That means the body of these people was retaining more protein during the day. So we measured that over 2 weeks, and these were older participants just eating less protein or more protein. So we have here evidence that eating 1.2 is better than eating 0.8. Okay. Another topic that comes up when you're talking about how much protein you should eat and where you should get your protein from is especially the source. So the source of the protein is very important because when you are choosing what you have in your meals, the source might impact how much protein you have in your plate. Okay. So you're just putting different foods on your plate, but depending on what you get, it might get harder to get a certain amount of protein. So let's have an example here. Let's say you're aiming for 30 to 35 grams of protein and you want to have that on your plate because you want to eat 30 or 35 grams of protein. So depending on what you put in your plate, you might require a higher volume of food to reach that number. So I have a couple of examples here. So let's say you want to get that 30 to 35 grams of protein from chicken. So to get that, you need around 100 to 110 grams of chicken breast, for example. But if you're gonna get the same amount of protein from tofu, you might need a little bit more. So it's important for you to know that depending on where you get your protein from, you might need a higher volume, a higher amount of that specific food to reach your target of protein. And I have here also eggs. So if you want 30 grams of 30 grams of protein from eggs, 5 large eggs might do the job. But if you want to get that same amount from lentils, you might need a big 2 cups or 2.5 cups of lentils to get the same amount of protein. I just want to highlight here that this is not a problem. It's just something that people need to be aware of. Okay, so you need to be aware that depending on what you get your protein from, you might have to think about how much you need of that specific food to reach your target amount of protein on your plate. Okay. Also, when you think about protein, another aspect that we saw in the response from the AI is protein quality. So what's protein quality? Protein quality rely on different aspects from the protein source itself. So let's say if you're getting protein from milk or from soy or from lentils, all those different proteins, they have first different amounts of essential amino acids. So those 9 essential amino acids, the amount of each one of those amino acids might change depending on the source of protein you're ingesting. Okay, so that's one thing that relies under the protein quality. High quality proteins usually have high quantity of essential amino acids. A low protein, a low quality protein usually has a lower amount of several or one essential amino acid. Okay, so one aspect that we discuss when you're talking about protein quality is the amount of essential amino acids you can find in that protein. Another aspect that's very important is, let's say I eat protein A, let's say I eat soy protein, for example. When that goes inside my stomach, it's going to be digested. And when it reaches the intestines, that's going to be absorbed. What we absorbed are the amino acids. So the amino acids, they are the building blocks of proteins. Those are the things that go to our blood after the absorption of the amino acids from the intestines, right? But one thing that might change depending on where I get my protein from is how efficient is the digestion of that protein. Some proteins might be harder for our body to digest just because they might be packed in a way in the protein that is harder for our stomach to digest, is harder for our intestines to digest. And depending on how hard it is, less amino acids I might get. So let's say I eat a protein that comes from a plant that has a lot of fiber. So fibers are good for our body, they're good for our intestines, so they have a lot of benefits. But they also make some things a little bit harder. Digestion is one of the examples. So digesting protein from food source that have a lot of fiber might be challenging. So it might be the case that some of the protein that's in that food source is not digested. If it's not digested, the amino acids don't go to my blood. That means I get less amino acids from that protein source. So when I'm talking about true ileal digestibility, I'm talking about how much of the amino acids that are in the proteins in that food are actually absorbed and go to the blood. Some proteins I can get more, for other proteins I can get less. A general rule is that for animal-based proteins, usually we get more. And from plant-based sources, I usually get a little bit less. Again, like we're going to see further in the presentation, that's not a problem. It's just something that you have to be aware of, okay? And when we're talking about muscle, another aspect that goes under protein quality is leucine content. So the amount of leucine we have in the protein we are ingesting is very important for muscle because how we're going to discuss later, leucine is a trigger for muscle protein synthesis. Is one of the main amino acids that activates muscle protein synthesis. So it's an amino acid important to build muscle. All essential amino acids are important. We need all of them. But leucine is one of the most important because it's the starter of the process that's going to build more muscle. Okay? So when we're talking about plant and animal-based proteins, we need to be aware that if I get the same amount of protein from plant-based or animal proteins, I might not get the same amount of amino acids in my blood because it might be harder to digest. It might be that the composition of amino acids in the plant-based sources and the animal-based sources are not the same. So the source is going to dictate what's going to show up in my blood. And what shows up in my blood is what matters for the muscle because the amino acids that are in the blood are going to end up in the muscle later and they're going to do some things important to build more muscle. Okay. So again, not a problem. You just need to be aware that depending on what you eat, you might get less amino acids showing up in the blood because of digestion, because of the composition of amino acids of those different proteins. Okay. When you're talking about essential amino acids, so I told you that usually animal-based proteins, they have all essential amino acids, so they are considered high-quality protein. When we go over plant-based proteins, they might have a lower amount of some specific essential amino acids. And I brought here two that are very famous. So in the case of grains, for example, so grains, they usually have a lower amount of lysine. And legumes, they usually have a lower amount of methionine. So those two are essential amino acids. And depending on where the protein is, so grains like oats, wheat, corn, and other sources, you might have a little bit less lysine. If you go over legumes, so soy, pea, lentils, beans, they might have a little bit less methionine. What is the whole idea here? Again, not a problem. You just need to be aware of that because when you're going to eat those sources, if you combine them, you might get the complete protein that you need. So usually if you eat animal-based proteins, you get pretty much everything you need. But when you go to plant-based sources, you might have to combine some sources, combine grains with legumes, for example, like rice and beans, or corn and soy, depending on your preferences. And then you have complete proteins, a complete protein that has everything that you need. So that's basically what we have here, right? So you combine different sources, in this example here, different plant-based sources, and the result is a complete essential amino acid profile. So just to reiterate, here is not a problem. So plant-based proteins are not a problem. You can very easily combine different sources and have everything you need. So just to go over a little bit more detail about digestibility. So I told you that depending on the protein source, it might be a little bit easier or harder to digest, and that's going to impact what's going to show up in your blood. So the protein that's in your plate is not actually everything that's going to show up in your blood. It all depends on the source. So usually animal sources have higher digestibility and they have higher essential amino acids content as well. So you have a lot of essential amino acids showing up in the blood after eating animal-based protein. When you go to whole plant foods, things might change. You have fibers, you have phytates, you have a lot of other things that are in the plant-based source that might turn the digestion and the absorption a little bit difficult. And then you might end up with a little bit less essential amino acids showing up in the blood. Again, not a problem. You just need to be aware of that. This is a paper that was published last year, and it goes over that protein quality aspect. You have a graph here that shows in the x-axis the digestibility. So if you go higher towards 1, that means it's easier to digest. In the y-axis, you have the content of essential amino acids. So if you go up, that means more essential amino acids. Basically, how do we interpret this? Everything that's up here is easier to digest and has more essential amino acids. So all those protein sources have more essential amino acids. They usually have all 9 of them, and they are easier to digest. Everything that here is here in the bottom, it is a little bit harder to digest, and it has a little bit less essential amino acids as well. So that's an important thing to know because that kind of knowledge can impact how you're gonna plan your diet in your meals. Again, all those food sources are great. You can eat all of them. You just need to be aware that depending on your choices, you might get something that has more or less essential amino acids or is easier or harder to digest. Another question for you. After going over all of this that we talk about protein quality, so we saw that we have digestion, we saw that we have essential amino acids content, and those things usually change when you are comparing animal-based proteins and plant-based proteins. So I want to know, what do you guys think? Can plant-based diet support muscle maintenance with aging without careful planning? Do you think you can follow a plant-based diet and not think much about it, just go and eat plant-based sources, and that's going to work? Please answer here for us. You have the option of yes, no, not sure. Okay, 10 more seconds. Okay, let's see what we got. No. Okay, a lot of people say no. Yeah, that would be the right answer. And we're gonna go over some things, and because planning is very important, simply because people need to be aware of how much and what they're eating. Okay, so thank you for answering, and I can see that a lot of people are concerned about that. So this is one piece of data that kind of gets in the answer for that question. So this graph comes from a paper that was published last year as well, and it talks about how important is protein quality and quantity and the relation between those two aspects. So we think about how much protein you're eating per day, and you are thinking about what kind of sources of protein you're choosing to have on your plate every day in every meal. Okay? So what we know now is that depending on how much protein you eat per day, the quality aspect might become more or less important. When protein quality is important, protein quality is more important. So here in this graph is this area of the graph. So more importance, high importance, when people eat less than 1.2 grams per kilo per day of protein. So if you're eating less than 1.2 grams per kilo per day of protein, protein quality matters a lot, actually. The lower you go, the more it matters. So eating high quality protein is very important if you're eating, if you have a lower protein intake per day. But then if you start eating more protein, that importance of protein quality goes down because quantity overcomes quality. And that usually happens after 1.2 grams per kilo per day. So the higher you go after 1.2 grams per kilo per day, the lower is the importance of protein quality. So that's very important for us to know. So if you want to eat a plant-based diet, it's very important for you to know that if you are here in the lower intake, you might be at risk because protein quality matters a lot. So planning your diet matters a lot here. And then if you go and increase your daily protein intake, it might become less and less important. So protein quality becomes less and less important. If you go with very high intakes, protein quality has zero importance at all, just because quantity overcomes quality. Okay? So this is the same study that I showed you before, but now I have another piece of data. So this is a study that I ran about 2 or 3 years ago. Again, older participants, around 70 years old, and we measure muscle protein synthesis over 2 weeks on a diet with less and more protein, like I showed you before. Before I showed you the data for whole body protein synthesis, this is just now is just muscle protein synthesis. We got a piece of the muscle of the thigh here, and we measure muscle protein synthesis here in the thigh of the muscles of those people participating in the study. First thing that we can see here is that eating more protein is better for muscle protein synthesis. So you synthesize more protein if you eat more protein during 2 weeks. So every day eating 1.2 grams per kilo per day. So eating more protein better than less protein. But another thing that I have here is the V group and the V condition and the LV condition. So both groups ate two diets for 2 weeks. They spent 2 weeks eating the V diet and 2 weeks eating the LV diet. The V diet is a vegan diet, and the LV diet is a lacto-vegetarian diet. So it has animal and plant-based protein. What we can see here is that for both daily protein ingestions, LV diet was higher than V diet. That means for this range of ingestion, so up to 1.2 grams per kilo per day, protein quality matters. So the choice of eating higher quality protein in the lacto-vegetarian group increased muscle protein synthesis in those people. Okay, so the takeaway here is that if you are in the lower range of daily protein intake, a higher daily protein intake builds more muscle, and a higher quality also builds more muscle. But again, if you go a little bit higher, if you pass 1.2, in this study, it was published last year, they tested older participants as well, and they gave a vegan diet or omnivorous diet. So omnivorous is a mix of plant-based and animal-based proteins. So they measure that during 10 days under vegan, 10 days under omnivorous diet. It was a crossover design as well. So people were eating diets in different order. What they found was that there was no difference in muscle protein synthesis when comparing both conditions. So it made no difference if the proteins were coming from vegan for a 100% plant-based diet, which is a vegan diet, or an omnivorous diet. So that means that if you go higher, if your daily intake is higher, you overcome the protein quality aspect that might impact lower daily protein ingestions. Okay. So what are the takeaways from here? So we know now that the 0.8 is for preventing deficiency, but it's not optimal to support muscle. So we're going to go with 1.2 to 1.6. Protein quality also impacts how efficient is the dietary protein, especially when you're talking about muscle. And remember that when you talk about protein quality, is essential amino acids content, is how easy it is to digest, and usually higher quality proteins, they come from animal sources. Okay, that might impact the size of the portion you're going to choose to have in your plate. If you have a lower quality protein, you might need a little bit more to obtain the essential amino acids you need. If you have a higher quality protein, you might need a little bit less. So it's something for you to think about it, okay? But also remember that daily protein ingestion overcomes protein quality. The more protein you ingest per day, the less you have to think about protein quality. Okay, so we went over protein a lot, but what does all of this has to do with muscle and aging, right? So one important thing when we think about aging is that during the aging process, one thing that's very, very easy to see when you look at the studies is that during the aging process, we lose muscle mass. So we lose muscle mass and we lose muscle function as we age. So when I say muscle function is how easy it is to do simple stuff we do every day, like standing up from a chair, climbing a flight of stairs, getting out from your car or getting in your car and doing like lifting a kid, for example, putting the dishes on cabinets. A lot of stuff we do every day start to become harder and harder as we age. When you look at the populational data, we see that people lose muscle mass and muscle function in different ways. Some people lose a little bit less, so it's the top line over here on this graph. And some people might lose a little bit more and much faster. And those people that lose a little bit more and much faster, they are at higher risk for frailty, higher risk of falls, higher risk of other morbidities like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases. So there's a big difference when you look at the populational data. And of course, everyone wants to be here in the top line. They want to age well. They wanna age with a high quality of life. But what is the main difference between those two populations? So I have it hidden here. The main difference is that usually those people here, they ingest more protein and they perform exercise, especially strength exercise. They are involved in some kind of a resistance training or some activities that are similar to resistance training. When I say resistance training, I'm talking about weightlifting. So activities that are similar to weightlifting. So those people here, they usually eat more protein per day, and they also perform some kind of a weight-bearing exercise or weightlifting exercise. People in the dashed line in the bottom, they usually do less physical activity and they also eat less protein. So we know that eating protein and performing exercise are very good predictors for healthy aging. But if you do the opposite, if you don't reach your daily protein allowances, and if you're not involved in exercise, might be part of the group here down in the bottom. Of course, we don't want that, because these people, this group over here is in a higher risk of being affected by different uh, morbidities and other situations that might put their lives at risk. So usually during the aging journey, a lot of things can happen. So you might not be eating well, you might not be exercising too much, and other things might happen. You might have a surgery, you might have a cold or a flu or a COVID, or you might have a twisted ankle, or you might be on a medication that can cause muscle loss. And that's very common. It happens a lot. Some of these things, they will happen to you at some point of your life. And those things, they might look like minor events, but if you are over 65 years old, they might have a huge impact on your muscle. So when I'm saying muscle, it's the amount of muscle you have in your body. So usually we call those disuse events. So if you have a surgery or a cold, a flu, or those things, they might make you just stay less active for a couple of days, for example, if you have to stay on a bed, on the couch for a couple of days. And during those days, your body might be losing muscle or losing the capacity of building muscle. And something that is very common is like the example I have here. This is a study that was ran in 2019, and they measure how much muscle people were losing when they were having a surgery for hip replacement. So over 6 days after the surgery, just because they had to stay in bed for more time than usual recovering from the surgery, those people were losing around 3 to 4% of their muscle mass. Losing 3 to 4% of your muscle mass is the same that you're going to lose in around 2 or 3 years of normal aging. So if you're aging well, losing that amount of muscle, it is expected. But if you need to have a surgery, you might lose that in just a week. Okay, so that's a very special thing, a very intense event, and that might impact your capacity to do some things over your day, like climbing stairs, do stuff at home. The recovery from that might be very harsh for some people. Other conditions that are very common in aging population, like sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is a syndrome that involves losing muscle mass and muscle function, among other things. You might have mental health issues also related to this condition. You might have malnutrition also related to that condition. So that's why it's called a syndrome. So it involves several different aspects during the aging process. People with sarcopenia, they lose much more muscle and much more muscle function over the aging process, especially after 40, 50 years old. They lose you can see that the loss of muscle mass and function is much more intense. And for those people, we might have to act earlier. Just as an example here, this study compared how much muscle people with 75 years old had in comparison to younger people around 25 years old. So comparing people of 25 years old and 75 years old, what they found was that people at 75 years old had around 20 to 30% less muscle in some specific parts of their body, especially the lower limbs might seem the most affected. So those people have around 20 to 30% less muscle in the lower limbs, and that is usually linked to a lower muscle function capacity as well. So it might be harder to walk, it might be harder to climb stairs. A lot of things might get harder during the day of those people. Well, another popular topic that has become a trend online is the use of medications for weight loss. Those medications are amazing. They can make people lose weight very fast, like 3, 6 months, you lose a reasonable amount of weight. But part of that weight that you lose might be lean mass as well. So most of the studies have been shown that people are losing around 15 to 25 of the weight as lean mass. Part of the lean mass is muscle. So you're losing a little bit of muscle when you're losing weight using those medications. That might not be a problem for some people, but for aging population that might be at risk of sarcopenia, those people might be at higher risk of losing too much muscle and losing too much muscle function as well. So when you get an older person, that event, it can be a surgery, it can be a cold, it can be an infection, or it can be the use of a medication, you're going to lose a little bit of muscle. It's okay to lose a little bit of muscle, sorry, if you are young, because usually it's easy to recover. That person comes back from the surgery, from the cold, and it recovers the muscle. But if you're talking about older individuals, what we see in the studies is that it's very common to see something like this. People lose muscle and then don't recover. And then something else happens, another cold, another COVID, for example, or it can be a joint issue, or it can be a knee pain, something that's going to cause that, that's going to make that person to walk less, stay a little bit more in bed or the sofa. And those events, they add up, and that person over years might be losing muscle mass and just in a way that's very hard to come back to the original state. And when you get older, when you think about is usually other things might bother you as well. It's not just that you got sick. It might be hard to eat because you have teeth issues. It might be hard to eat because you don't have much appetite, and your appetite changes over the years. And you might have other things bothering you. So it's that ankle, it's that knee, it's that hip that bothers you. You're just walking less, doing less, and all those events add up, and because of that, you might have an incomplete recovery, if a recovery at all. And if you don't recover, that's going to impact your muscle function as well. It's going to just be harder for you to cope over the things that you have to do during the day. So we saw that aging might lead to loss of muscle mass and function. We can have other things that might happen that can amplify that. Exercise and protein, they might help, and we're going to see a little bit more about that. Sarcopenia can be a complicating factor for some people because you might have other conditions that can add up and just make you lose more muscle. And if you lost a lot of muscle, it might just be hard to recover. So you might have to act fast, and this person actually needs help to recover. Okay, going to the last part. So when you're talking about muscle, like in why protein important for muscle and why protein important for aging. One very important thing to know is that our muscle is rebuilding itself every day, every time. So all the time, 24 hours, we have two processes happening at the same time. We have muscle protein synthesis. I showed you some data about that. But we also have muscle protein breakdown. So those two things are happening at the same time, all the time in our muscle. So we need to break down things that are not very good anymore. So proteins that suffer from oxidative stress or mechanical stress, a lot of different stressors, they can just damage proteins, and we need to break them down. We break them down and we recycle some of those amino acids, okay? And then when you talk about protein synthesis, this is a process when we are rebuilding things. So we break down to rebuild, and to rebuild, we use some of the blocks we got from the breakdown, but we also use the blocks we got from our diet. So when you eat protein, those amino acids, they are used in the synthesis, but we also recycle some amino acids from the breakdown. This is a very important process to renew our muscles every day. And that's something that gets slower when we age. So over the aging process, these synthesis and breakdown processes, they just don't work as efficient. And that makes our muscles more susceptible to different things that might happen during our lives. Okay. One important thing to activate muscle protein synthesis, which is one of the main aspects to build muscle, is the amino acid leucine. So when we eat protein, you digest protein, you absorb the amino acids, and the leucine in that protein is going to be an important signal to activate muscle protein synthesis. A very important protein to be activated in our muscles is a complex called mTORC1. So it's a group of proteins that are activated by leucine. When you activate this protein, you activate muscle protein synthesis. So depending on the amount of leucine you have in your diet, that might change your capacity to activate muscle protein synthesis. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So every time we eat protein, we activate muscle protein synthesis, and that's why we have this in this here in this uh, uh, figure here. So all the bars here that are in the upper part of the graph are muscle protein synthesis. So you have one meal that activates muscle protein synthesis. Leucine is a very important amino acid to activate muscle protein synthesis here. But remember, we always need all the essential amino acids for that. So all essential amino acids are important, but leucine is an important trigger. Then you have muscle protein synthesis going down. A second meal goes up again, goes down. A third meal goes up again. So over the day, depending on how many meals you have, how much protein and essential amino acids you have in your diet, you're going to have those cycles of going up and down, up and down. Very important. We don't want protein synthesis to be up all the time. There are a lot of studies showing that it's not good for health. What we need is cycling. We need ups and downs, ups and downs. So we don't need people eating protein all the time, eating leucine all the time. That's not good for health. That actually there are several studies showing that that's very bad. So we want that cycling going up and down for protein synthesis. Okay. The balance over the day, over the 24 hours between synthesis and breakdown, is going to tell us if this person is going to gain or lose muscle. If you have more synthesis than breakdown, you gain muscle. If synthesis and breakdown are the same, you maintain the amount of muscle you have. If you have less synthesis than breakdown, you lose muscle over weeks and months. Okay. One important thing that we need to know is that when we get older, our muscles don't respond the same way to protein. So there's something called anabolic resistance, and that is the way our muscles respond to protein. On the left side here, we have people fasting, so young and old people fasting, protein synthesis the same in their muscles. But then when we give them protein, we can see here on the right side that the young population here, the young group, responded to the protein ingestion and the elderly didn't respond. So that's called anabolic resistance, and that's the muscle of the elderly not responding the way it should respond. So when we are young, our muscles respond to a very small amount of protein, increasing muscle protein synthesis. As you get older, depending on a lot of different factors, diseases, how active you are, your muscles might start to respond less and less, and that's anabolic resistance. So that's a problem, that's an issue that we have to deal with when you're thinking about how much protein an older person has to eat. Okay, so for the young person, it's very easy to activate muscle protein synthesis. If you think about a meal, like 20 grams of protein usually does the job, activates muscle protein synthesis very easily. But for an older person, the same 20 grams doesn't do the same. So we have that wall, that resistance, and that amount of protein is not enough. So you have to go with a higher amount per meal to activate muscle protein synthesis. In this example, you have to go with 30 or 40 grams of protein in one meal to be able to activate muscle protein synthesis. Again, I'm trying to overcome anabolic resistance. So for younger people, low amount of protein per meal, you activate muscle protein synthesis every meal, no problem. For an older person, becomes difficult. So the same amount of protein the young are eating might not be enough to activate muscle protein synthesis at a level that is enough to maintain or gain muscle mass over the weeks and months. And that is one of the main reasons why people lose muscle mass over the course of the aging process. They're just not reaching muscle protein synthesis level that's enough to keep their muscle mass over months and years. Almost getting to the end here now. So one thing that you have to think about when you are planning meals for an older person is how much protein you have in each meal. So if you are young, you might not have to think about that. But if you are older, you might have to think. And here, this is just an example. So let's say you eat 3 meals a day. You don't need to eat 3 meals a day. This is just an example. Some people might have just 1 meal a day or 2 meals a day or 4 meals a day. But what really matters here is that let's say you have anabolic resistance in your muscle. If you have anabolic resistance, eating a breakfast with 10 grams of protein is not enough to activate muscle protein synthesis. And having a lunch later with 15 grams of protein is also not enough. So over the course of most of your day here, if I'm going with this example, this person might not activate muscle protein synthesis at all, just because it's not enough protein in their meals to activate those processes, right? And then the last meal has a lot of protein, 60 grams, that's enough. It goes over the threshold, you activate with just that meal. But this meal might not be enough to maintain muscle mass over weeks and months. So we have to think about how to solve this. And one way to think about that is to split the protein you eat during your day more or less evenly over your meals. So you have a breakfast, lunch, and dinner that has more or less the same amount. What we are aiming here is to go over the threshold. So you activate muscle protein synthesis. And of course, to do that, you have to think about your diet, right? So it's very hard to choose what we eat. Some people don't think about what they eat at all. They just go and make the choices depending on what's available. That's not good. So it's very important to plan your diet and know that you need to reach a certain protein amount every meal. Otherwise, you might just miss an opportunity to reach your target for the day. So I have some examples here. Let's say you go for your breakfast, is a donut and a coffee. I love donut, but donut and coffee together, even with a little bit of milk, it's just 6 grams of protein. So that's not enough to activate your muscle protein synthesis. So you miss it, that opportunity to activate your muscle protein synthesis here. Let's say you go for a snack later and it's a cookie or chips. Again, 4 grams of protein, not enough. Another missed opportunity, right? And then you go with other choices, cheeseburger, pizza, not good as well. Too many calories. You might have the protein you need there. It's too many calories per gram of protein. So not good choices. So it might be the case that you plan your diet and try to make healthy choices, thinking about other nutrients beside protein. So fiber is important. Vitamins are important. Minerals are important. There are a lot of different aspects of your diet you have to think about it as well. But here I'm focused on protein. So think about how to plan your diet so you have enough protein and it comes from good sources and that you can incorporate in a diet that is planned to not just support the protein that you need, but also other nutrients that you need. Last question before we close this. So because we're talking about protein, I have one question for you. Just eating enough protein is enough. If you think about aging, about like an old person, do you think that's enough to keep your muscle mass in your muscle function? What do the studies show? What do you think the science shows about this? Just reaching your protein target is enough? Do I need exercise or not? So please say if this statement's true or false. If I eat enough protein, I don't need to exercise. True or false or not sure? 5 more seconds. Okay, let's see what we got. False. Yeah, it's false. Very good. Uh, very good. Okay, so it is false. I saw that some people said not sure. So let's make sure everybody's on the same page. Okay, so I'm a dietitian and I'm sad to say that protein, just eating protein is not enough. Okay, so unfortunately, if you just think about your diet, is not enough to maintain muscle mass and muscle function. So even if you go for that range between 1.2 and 1.6, we see a lot of studies that when people eat that, that's not enough if they don't do some kind of exercise in parallel to adjusting their diets. So exercise is key. And I think that goes towards the mission of our institute here. So it's not just about diet, it's about other aspects of your life. And exercise is a key factor to make protein work. So protein, eating more protein works, but it only works if you exercise. That's the message I want you to take home. Okay. So and why that's the case, I want to go over that and we're going to finish right after that. Okay. So when we eat protein, we saw that that increases muscle protein synthesis. So that's the effect of protein itself. This effect comes from the essential amino acids and leucine in your protein meal. Okay? But something different happens when you exercise. So when you perform resistance exercise, your muscles become more sensitive to protein. You transport more amino acids inside your muscles, from the blood to your muscles. So you amplify the muscle protein synthesis response in your muscle when you exercise. Okay, so that's one reason why exercise is key. So protein in your diet is the resource, but exercise is key to amplify the use of that resource. So here we have normal protein synthesis and breakdown. After you exercise, you have a higher muscle protein synthesis response after every meal. And very important, the effect of exercise can last up to 24 to 48 hours. So 1 day to 2 days after the exercise, your muscles are still responding more to every meal you have. So that's very important because if you exercise today, 2 days after, you're still with the effect of that exercise session in your muscles in terms of the response to protein. That's very useful. Okay. It's very important that everybody knows that. Okay. To close our topic here today. So after going over all of that, what does the science shows when we go over studies where people do exercise and protein? Does that have any meaningful result in terms of lean mass, muscle strength, and muscle function? So I ran this meta-analysis a couple of years ago. So we went over all the literature. We got all the studies that tested exercise and protein in young and older individuals. I'm going to highlight just the results in the older individuals here. So we found that if you do resistance exercise and you eat more protein, yes, older individuals, so plus 65 years old, they gain lean mass if they do that. If they just eat protein, they don't. But if they do exercise and protein, they do. they gained lean mass over the studies. They also gained strength. They also improve their physical function. When I say physical function, there's a lot of physical function tests. People run those studies, it's like walking, climbing stairs, stand up from a chair, and all those things get better if you do resistance exercise and protein. So the science is very clear. Protein plus exercise works for improving muscle, not just the mass, but also the function. And that's one of the most important things for aging, because aging is about how easy it is to perform daily basis tasks, right? So we want to have higher quality of life, and that's muscle function. So to finalize, I want you guys to leave this webinar with this message. What is the most important thing you have to think about when you're talking about protein? The most important message is here at the bottom of this pyramid. So the most important thing is daily protein ingestion. Try to reach 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilo per day. So that's your target. That's the most important thing. And like I said, more protein only works with regular exercise. It can be twice times a week. It doesn't need to be more than that. If you can do more, it's okay. But at least twice a week, it's enough. If you put those two together, you get 90 to 95% of the effect. So 90 to 95% of the effect on muscle mass and function comes from those two factors at the bottom. The other two factors here on the top, so distributing protein over the meals and protein quality, they are just a small amount of the final effect. So if you do this, you can think about those other two. If you're not doing those factors in the bottom, it is not worth it to think about quality and distribution yet. You have to be sure you're eating the right amount per day, and you have to be sure you're exercising. Okay? So that's the final message I want everything to get. Thank you very much for listening to all of this. I hope you get something useful from this, and I'm happy to answer any questions now.
Okay, thank you so much, Everson. So I think a lot of great information. I just want to remind everyone that we are going to share the complete slides. So if you missed something, if you want to go back and check it out, yeah, everyone's going to have the opportunity to do that. I am going to read some of the questions throughout. We're going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to go through, I'll kind of collapse a couple together. One of the big questions that I see, Everson, is about how we calculate the 1.2 to 1.6 range. Is that based off of our current body weight or our ideal body weight?
Yeah.
What number are we using to get this estimate of how much protein we need?
Yeah, it's very, very common for dietitians and people that work with that especially if people are aiming to lose weight, they can use the body weight they want to get to. So if you wanna lose 5 kilos, you use the body weight, your body weight minus the 5 kilos you want to lose. Uh, but I see a problem with that, because usually when you're losing weight, you lose not just body mass, but you also lose muscle, right? So I would say it's better to not using a number, a body weight number in specific, and just go for a higher protein intake. Just aim for a higher protein intake with the body weight you have now. So use the number you have now and multiply that by a higher protein intake, because the higher protein intake is going to spare the loss of muscle mass. So use the body weight you have now and go for a higher target, let's say 1.6, and then use that number to use as a reference.
Okay, great. Another question is just about how these ranges are potentially influenced by things like biological sex or the height of a person or their BMI. Do you think that there's any influence of these personal characteristics, or do you think that that 1.2 to 1.6 range is pretty encompassing for people to fit into?
Yeah, so There are studies running like sex-based comparisons, no difference there. So there's no uh, male female difference in protein metabolism so far, that as far as we know. And a lot of studies have looked into that already. So I think that's pretty clear so far. You don't need to think about biological sex. The height question, usually that's going to impact your body weight. So the taller you are, that's going to impact your body weight in some way as well. So usually that's not a problem. So the body weight has been so far the best measure, the number we use to calculate protein. The BMI, then you might have to be a little bit careful with the BMI because there are studies showing that people with higher BMIs, because they have higher body fat percentages, they might have uh, a different protein metabolism. So they people with higher BMI, because they have higher body fat, there are studies showing that they might also have anabolic resistance caused by higher body fat. So if that's the case, you might use a higher protein ingestion as well, the higher daily protein ingestions, just to overcome that anabolic resistance that has been caused there in the case for the higher fat body percentage.
Okay, great. Another question that's coming up repeatedly is about this idea, is there a ceiling of which we'd say that we don't want to exceed? So we don't want to have a meal with too much protein.
Yep.
So is there a saturation of how much on a per meal basis? There is some comments related to, the intake of protein and kidney function.
Yep.
So any comments there? We kind of the message I maybe got is that we need to go higher than the current recommendations, but is it potentially a possibility to go too high?
Yeah. So the first question, is there a limit to like how much protein you can eat in a meal, right? So over, let's say, until 3 years ago, the answer for that question will be around 40 grams per meal. Until 3 years ago, that was the answer. So around 40 to 50 grams of protein per meal. And we had some data that would support that. But we had one study published 2 years ago where people gave 100 grams of protein in one meal. And that 100 grams, when you measure muscle protein synthesis over 24 hours, was very clear in the study that people were using all that protein. So all that 100 grams that people ate in one meal was used over the 24 hours to build muscle as well. So that question about the limit today, based on the data we have from that study, the 40, 50 grams answer is not supported anymore. So apparently in young people, there's no limit. So you can eat a lot of protein and your body is going to find a way to use it. If the scientists measure that over a long period of time, okay? If there is any problems with kidney function, so we don't have studies showing that on this range is not safe. So the studies show that in people with no kidney disease, kidney function is not changed in that range. But we don't have enough studies with much higher ingestions, let's say 3 grams per kilo, 4 grams per kilo, which is like the dose that some bodybuilders use. So we don't have studies showing what happens with those doses. But with this range that we are using right now, the studies don't show any kind of negative effects at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. One of the things, another question that was asked here is about how do we get some insight into how much protein is maybe in the foods that we have, right? So maybe particularly for animal-based products where we don't
Yep.
have labels that tell us how much protein, is there a website or is there a source that people would use to estimate that you've kind of used in your presentation here for some of the examples?
I can send some references. So you have some official databases. A lot of countries they have official databases But one thing to know is that those official databases, they usually use averages, right? So you have different labs calculating, and they might not be specific to a brand of product that you are intending to buy. So my recommendation would be to trust on the labels. So read the labels, the nutrition facts on the labels, and usually having the protein amount on the label is mandatory. It needs to be there. So what is a little bit tricky for some people is the portion size because depending on the brand, they might play with the numbers. So how much protein per portion, how much protein per 100 grams of that product. So you might have to play with the math, but protein amount in that food is usually on the label. So, and you can trust that. So, because if it is not 100% accurate, it's going to be close to the number what it should be. Things might change depending on where you get the product from, but here in Canada, I think we are more or less safe.
Okay. One of the questions was about your example with the lentils. So you
Yep,
had 30 grams of protein, and you talked about in the lentils that was about 2.5 cups.
yep.
Does that factor in that absorption efficiency difference compared to animal based, or is that now on top of that
No, that is a raw comparison of the protein amount. So that question,
in the food?
yeah, in the food. That question is very important. So my example there was just about comparing the raw protein amount in the food. So you get the same protein amount. But if I want to compensate for different amounts of essential amino acids, I might have to go higher depending on the food. So for lentils, for example, I might have to go with let's say 20 or 30% more just to compensate for the absorption of the essential amino acids? Yeah, that's a great question.
Okay, another question is kind of about this idea about more and more. And you talked a little bit about that we don't have any known negative consequences, I think, at this kind of range of protein
Yep.
intakes.
Yep.
What about a role of protein intake on the suppression of appetite? Is there
Yeah.
any data on that?
Yeah. So there are studies showing that protein suppress appetite, but people have to realize that when people advertise those effects, sometimes it might sound that it is a lot, but that's not true. So protein has an effect on satiety, so it decreases appetite, but it's not by a huge amount. So the effect is there, but is small. And of course, when you, even if it is small for an older person that also has lower appetite because of the aging or other factors, that can add up. So that is an issue that it is a problem when you are designing studies, designing diets, recommending diets with more protein for people that are aging for sure. So you have to think about that. And the way to go around that is very good personalized work. So you have to work very close to that person to understand the food preferences, the food choices you can use to overcome that repression of appetite, and then just to try to reach a certain protein target for that person. So it is there, it is small, but for an older person, it might have a significant effect. Yeah.
Okay, there's a kind of another question that links up with that. Is
Yeah.
using satiety a good marker? Then, do you think it's a good marker of understanding if you've had adequate protein intake? So
No,
I have a meal and I feel really full. Is that sufficient,
no.
or is it unrelated to protein intake in
Yeah,
that
so
sense?
yeah, that's a good question as well. Yeah, unfortunately, is not a good indicator. So appetite in humans is regulated by different factors, but one strong factor is volume of food. So the more food you eat, the more you might feel satiated right after the meal. So the volume might depend of the what you eat as well, right? So if you eat more plant-based foods, you might have a bigger volume and you might feel satiated earlier in that meal. So when I was running that study that I showed you guys some of the data, one big problem that we had with the group eating 1.2 grams per kilo per day. In the vegan diet was exactly that. So people were getting satiated. So they're just not hungry at all after eating half of the meal, just because the volume of food was so big to reach the 1.2 grams per kilo per day of protein target. So the volume seems to be one important aspect to regulate appetite, not so much the amount of calories you're eating or some of the food choices you make.
Okay, great. Another question here that's an extension. We've talked a lot about different whole foods that you can eat, but what about supplements? So I can't get enough protein in my diet. Are protein supplements an effective way to boost your intake?
Yeah, great question as well. Yeah, so yeah, supplements are very useful. So they most like if you get a reliable brand that has no contaminants, they are very useful. They do a good job supplying more protein in your diet. Depending on your sort of the choices that you have. So if you eat plant-based protein, for example, now we have on the market several brands that offer plant-based options as well. So it's not a limiting factor anymore. So of course, yeah, you can use supplements and there's no problem with that for sure. Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations around that? So, there's different types of protein that you can buy. Is there different constituents? Is
Okay. Yeah.
there
So yeah.
anything?
Yeah. So when you go plant-based, the most popular products now, they are a mix of different proteins, or they might be just pea protein. So you have soy protein, you have pea protein, you might have potato protein, or a mix of pea and rice protein. So those are, I would say, the most popular plant-based. For animal-based, of course, the most popular of all is whey protein. So whey protein comes from dairy, and it is, I would say, the most popular supplement out there. But of course, you can always find other types of protein. There's beef protein now. You can also buy that kind of protein, and there's also casein. Casein is also available, and I would say one of the first protein supplements that was available before whey was albumin. So egg albumin was pretty much one of the first ones. So those are all animal-based options, and they all work more or less at the same way. There are a lot of discussions and debates on the internet about which one is better, but when you test those supplements head by head in research, you see that the long-term effect is exactly the same. It doesn't really matter where the protein comes from or what kind of protein it is, as long it supplies the essential amino acids you need. You might have to adjust the dose a little bit, but it's pretty much that. So they all work.
Okay. And I know we have lots of questions, so I am trying to get through them here. The question is about where does the amino acid pool come into play, about how we kind of store amino acids after a meal.
Yeah, so once you absorb the amino acids from the meal, it goes to the blood, and then the first passage is the liver. So the liver gets a lot of amino acids, and when you measure whole body protein synthesis, actually, the liver is one of the organs that synthesize most of the protein. So it uses a lot of those amino acids. Some amino acids that are going to escape the liver, and they're going to go to other tissues, right? And then muscle is going to absorb some of those amino acids, and some of those are going to be used for protein synthesis. But remember, when I said muscle protein synthesis and breakdown are always working 24/7, and because the breakdown is working, some of those amino acids that come from breakdown are going to be recycled. So you have that pool amino acids inside your muscle, and that pool is formed by amino acids coming from the diet, amino acids coming from the breakdown. During fasting, we usually use most the amino acids that are coming from breakdown to synthesize protein. But if you eat something, you're gonna use the ones coming from the diet as well. And those amino acids coming from the diet are gonna increase in the pool inside the muscle. So the pool is always there, but is always being recycled with amino acids coming from the breakdown and from the diet.
Okay, great. An important question as we think about aging and loss of muscle mass and muscle function, right? And, sometimes thinking kind of like that 1% kind of per year or something like that estimate is, can we actually improve? So, I've been on this normal aging process, and now I decide I'm going to focus on my diet or resistance exercise. So, can you regain some of that muscle function and especially in older adults?
Yeah, so the observational studies, you have different types of studies, observational studies and randomized clinical trials, right? So the observational studies, they're good to show us if people exercising more, controlling their diet, they have a lower uh, decrease in muscle mass and muscle function. And the studies, they show this. People that ingest more protein, do more exercise, they have a lower loss of muscle mass and muscle function. But that comes from an observational study. So we can't say for sure that's exercise and diet. We can say that people that exercise more and eat more protein have a lower decrement in muscle mass and muscle function. From the randomized clinical trials, we have good evidence showing that not just you can decrease the loss of muscle mass, but you can make people to gain muscle mass. It all depends on the population. If you're dealing with a population that's sarcopenic, for example, those people already lost muscle mass and muscle function as well. And you have usually a lot of other factors around their lives that are also the cause of that muscle loss and physical function loss. It's not just diet, it's not just the lack of exercise. Those two are very good predictors, but they're not the only factors. You have mental health, you might have sleep, you might have other aspects of the diet that might be contributing to that, like low vitamin D, for example, low calcium. You have low omega-3 fatty acids. There's all other aspects of their lives that might be linked to that as well. So you have to think about the population. Some studies, if you have a study with sarcopenic people and then you run the study, give the diet, give the exercise, and they don't lose muscle mass over 6 months, that's amazing because they're not losing more. But if you have, for example, a study with people that are not sarcopenic, they're older, but they're not sarcopenic, and then you work with the diet, work with the exercise, you might see in those populations gain. And that is very good as well, because not just they're not losing, but they're gaining. So it all depends on the population you're talking about. So I can't give you a straight answer because it depends on the population.
But I think the key message is that no matter what the population, they see some level of an improvement,
Yeah,
right? There
yeah,
that there is no one that doesn't see an improvement
yeah,
when they do resistance exercise and increase protein
yeah,
intake. So it's just that the magnitudes might differ based off of the
yeah,
population that's studied.
yeah.
Okay,
Perfect.
so there's a couple of questions really about the exercise component as well. So,
Yeah.
how close to exercise should you eat? So, you are doing a bout of resistance exercise, and so there's some questions about what counts as resistance exercise.
Okay.
But then when you think about that, how close do I eat before? Do I eat
Yeah,
after? Is there
yeah.
a window?
So let's go with the before and after question first, like when to eat, right? So again, if that was like 10 years ago, I would say eat very close to the exercise session. That was the answer 10 years ago, because we had studies showing that muscle protein synthesis was higher for people eating close to the exercise. And then the debate there was like eating right before or right after. Right after was showing a little bit more evidence. But so that was 10 years ago because we didn't have the technology we have today to measure muscle protein synthesis over days. We only had back there ways to measure muscle protein synthesis over hours. So when you read the result over hours, eating close to the exercise session was showing higher muscle protein synthesis. So that was a clear answer. But now that we have the technology to measure over days and weeks, what we see in the studies is that it doesn't matter. Our body got to where it is today because it can adapt. So our body uses protein because it knows protein is a precious nutrient. It's very hard to get protein in nature. We developed a society that is very easy for us to get protein now. But that was not the case when we evolved. So when you get the studies measuring over a week, over 2 weeks, we can see that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you eat right before, right after, hours after, or 6 hours after. Where you eat your protein doesn't matter at all. That's the answer we're getting from the studies measuring long-term responses to when you eat your meals.
I think that's a really good point. So we often think about calorie intake and we're counting calories and we
Yeah,
count calories on a per meal basis instead of thinking about it on a longer time scale,
yeah,
like a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week, a month. And so I think that's a really nice interpretation.
yeah.
The second part is just what counts as resistance exercise?
Yeah.
What are some examples that you can provide or,
Yep.
tips for people?
Yep. Yeah. So you have traditional resistance exercise, which is like the weightlifting. You can go to a gym or you can have a couple of dumbbells or some equipment at home, and you can do some exercise where you're lifting weights or pulling things against the resistance, and that's traditional resistance exercise. But of course, depending on your reality, you might have to go with different things. So, for example, climbing stairs is a kind of resistance exercise because you are pushing your body up or just resisting your body going down the steps depending on what you're doing. So that's another kind of resistance exercise, but it's for your legs. And you can increase the load wearing a backpack or a vest with weights. You, so that's considered resistance exercise as well. Another thing that in Hamilton, McMaster University, people have been working with is bands, so elastic bands. So you can use elastic bands to create resistance and perform exercise. So that counts as resistance exercise as well. Another thing that's more common on our daily tasks, let's say you go grocery shopping and then you're carrying your bags from the grocery store to your car and then from the car to inside your house. That's resistance exercise as well, because you are carrying something heavier and you might have to walk with that weight from the car to your house. So that's resistance exercise as well. Things that don't count as much. So just walking. Walking is good for a lot of things, but it doesn't count as much. For a person that doesn't do anything at the beginning, the walking can increase muscle mass in the legs. It is very good for cardiovascular function and other aspects of exercise. But once you reach a certain level of adaptation to that, walking doesn't help that much. So you might have to do different activities like climbing stairs. You might have to do things where you are lifting, pulling weights. That I would say is the main message.
Okay, I'm just reading some of the other questions, and I apologize. There's lots of questions here. We won't be able to get to all of them today. I know that Dr. Nunes has his contact information here, so
Yep.
I'm sure that he'd be willing to respond to some of your questions.
Yep.
One of the questions is about creatine supplementation.
Yep.
So here we have potential resistance exercise. We're talking about protein intake. But now we hear a lot about creatine supplementation. That's
Yep.
very in the media right now for muscle mass and other secondary factors.
Yeah. Creatine is a supplement very popular, has been studied for years as well. You again is another example that if you think about muscle, it only works with exercise. If you just take creatine and you don't do exercise, the studies show that you don't gain any muscle mass and there's minimal improvement in muscle function as well. So if you're thinking about taking creatine, the studies show that you need to exercise, you need to do some form of resistance exercise to support, to be the spark that's gonna make the creatine do their job, do their job as well. Okay, so it only works with exercise.
Okay, great. I'm just going through, just trying to pick off some other ones here. One is about, and this is a good question. So many people will go to their family physician and ask about diet. Do you know how much nutritional information is that they have to be able to provide this sort of guidance or recommendations?
Yeah, I would say here in Canada is actually a little better because a lot of physicians they need to have an undergrad in another program before they apply to med school, right? So some might have a degree in biology, biomedicine, or some courses they actually have nutrition in their curriculum. But a lot of doctors around the world, they don't have nutrition at all. So depending on the background of your family doctor, this person might have had some background in nutrition, and that might help this doctor to guide some recommendations. But I like to highlight that that is something that needs to change because if people only rely on their family doctors, they're actually not very well equipped to provide the best information. They might have an idea because they go after information because people ask them all the time, and some people might do a better job than others. But I would say it's very deficient. So I think the whole education system regarding medicine it needs to improve on that side for sure.
Yeah, and I would just remind people that that's why Ontario has registered dietitians
Yeah,
as a regulated health profession. So it is dedicated on its own to being able to answer questions related to diet, dietary planning, protein intake, and really the coordination of a lot of these questions. Well, I think we have time for only one more question today, and I want to get to a question about where we're getting protein. And so someone nice astutely said a recent trip to Costco, I was
yeah,
inundated with protein infused products. So I think it's in Kraft Dinner, mac and cheese,
yeah.
pancake mix, right? And
Oh my gosh.
so we're now starting to think of, protein as the source, but how do we parse that out with it being a processed food
Yep.
versus maybe another question was related on the animal protein side about
Yep.
the potential of cholesterol intake of consuming high cholesterol based foods.
Yep.
So is there a balance there, or do you have recommendations on kind of how to navigate that nutritional minefield?
Yeah, I would say I'm an advocate for whole foods. So I would say major part of your diet should be whole foods. I know it's a pain. I know it's hard to cook. I know it's hard to find whole food dishes to eat. I deal with that every day. So my favorite food is pizza, but I can't eat pizza every day, all the time. So I wish I could, but I can't. So what people need to understand is the answer for a good diet is to work with whole foods, fresh food. So again, cooking is complicated. There's time, there's learning involved. But if you know how to cook and you use fresh food, whole foods, you are in a much better position of having a good diet. We have the convenience today of finding all those products that are ready-made, that are very convenient, that you just go to the grocery store, you buy it, you take home, put it in the microwave, it's ready. So that is okay, but should be occasional, should be once in a while, not all the time, not all the meals. So I would highlight, try to work with whole foods. And if you want to use one of those options, there's high protein mac and cheese, high protein tortillas, high protein bread. you can use those as well. There's no problem. There's no data showing that that's a problem. Usually the protein that's there in those products is pea protein anyway. It's pea protein, is potato protein, is rice protein. Those products usually have those kind of proteins because it's the cheaper protein to put it there. And that's good protein. But again, try if you work with fresh food, whole foods, you can have a much better diet quality overall. And that can improve other aspects, not just the protein aspect of your diet.
Okay, thank you so much. So I really like to thank everyone. This has been a great crowd that's stuck around to the end. I know there's going to be a survey that's coming around from Alumni Affairs and Development, and I would just encourage anyone that if they have ideas or recommendations for future seminars that you would like to hear about, please type it into that survey, and we're more than happy to be receptive on how to develop kind of the seminar series moving forward. So thank you very much, Dr. Everson, for Dr. Nunes, for your talk. It was really appreciated. I know it's generated lots of questions, and we're really excited to see what you do next.
No. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you for the invite again. Thanks, Phil.